So I'm going to begin. Let's get that off. All right, thank you everyone for coming. Aloha a mahalo I ko'onei hele ana mai, which means in Hawaiian, thank you for coming to this presentation. The title of my presentation is Female, Afa-kasi and Untitled, Intersectional Career Experiences of Samoan Women. I want to firstly acknowledge Sari and Dejari and the Bridge Network. Thank you for hosting me, and also the other two people who are part of this, and that is Emeritus Professor Nigel Hayworth and Senior Lecturer Helen Delaney from the University of Auckland, when they were with me in this project when we first put it together. Okay, so to begin with, I want you to have a look at this vignette, this quote that came from one of the participants in the study, and it reads, "We are our own worst enemy. Instead of building each other up, we rip them down." So there's the glass ceiling that we use to destroy themselves. So I want you to think about this quote, because when we did this study, this quote was critical to why we put the study together. And it was, I guess it was the most strongest and emotive quote that made me want to present the information of this research to this platform and everywhere else. So this is a real quote that came from one of the participants who is Samoan and was a politician at the time. And we're going to come back to this quote later in the session. So this research, I've got to contextualize Pacific, what Pacific means in this research, and it refers to people whose ancestry, language, culture, and heritage originate from the South Pacific. So I'm using the definition from the Ministry for Pacific Peoples, and that's 2022. And so the participants came from these islands, Pacific people, Niue, Tokelau, Tuvalu, Fiji, Tonga, Cook Islands, Samoa, Kiribati, Rotorua, and the Lesser Islands. The thing about the Pacific from this research is that we tend to share the same fundamental institutions and values. So this is all about the ainga, the family, spirituality, hierarchy, respect, reciprocity, and the collective. There are unique Pacific characteristics. So sometimes we have to be careful when we use that word Pacific, because it's an umbrella term, whereas we don't really identify as Pacific. We identify as either Samoan or Tongan, not necessarily Pacific. So I just have to make sure that we contextualize and acknowledge that each of the islands in the Pacific have their own unique nuances and differences. And so, for example, the way that we came to New Zealand, the migratory patterns are different for some of the Pacific islands. So this research is about the brown glass ceiling, and I'm using some of the findings from that research to put together this seminar. And so some of the things that we know about Pacific people is that they came here to New Zealand in the 1950s. And they came here as a result of labor shortages. So some of the viewers who are watching today know the story behind it. So they came here in the 1950s and in the 1960s. And as you can see in the picture, many of the Pacific people worked in labor type jobs, so manufacturing, in construction. The women tended to work in nursing or in food and hospitality or in the services. And so a lot of the ways that they came into New Zealand, so the way that they came into New Zealand, you'll find that today the Pacific people are still clustering in those types of jobs. The reason why that this is important is because the space that I'm coming from is diversity and inclusion. And so we're in this globalized movement where we're trying to be inclusive. We're trying to look and include different types of races in our studies. And this is why this research is important to me. One of the facts about this research is that Samoans, who dominate almost half of the Pacific population in New Zealand, we are one of the fastest growing ethnic groups in New Zealand alongside Māori. And as mentioned, we're found in manufacturing, in construction, women are found in the service sector. But guess what? We're not really found in managerial type roles. In fact, we are the smallest percentage in New Zealand when it comes to CEOs, director type positions, executives, and managerial roles. It's actually very small. And so what that indicated to me is that there must be something in this, that Samoans and the Pacific people, we're probably experiencing more career barriers than any other ethnic race in New Zealand. So that was the impetus for me to start looking at this topic. Why is that the problem? Why is that the issue? Some of the things that we know already, that there's a lot of research out there about ethnic minority, women. I've also done some research on Samoans. Just going to turn that off. I've already done some research about Samoans and career inequality. So in those boxes, discrimination, lack of privilege, environmental issues, and poverty, these are some of the things that are creating career barriers. So when we look at privilege, for example, we know that there's evidence to show that when Europeans or people from predominantly white countries, when they come to New Zealand, they are fast-tracked into these top jobs, whereas ethnic minorities, those who are brown-skinned, who are darker-skinned, they actually have it harder. So there is evidence to support that there is a privilege that's happening out there that blocks some ethnic minorities from getting into these top jobs. We also know that from the COVID-19, that really demonstrated some of the issues that Pacific and Māori were facing in terms of access to resources, where for some of us, we were denied access that would help us to reach some of the services that were available to us. There's also knowledge of women, how women receive the lowest forms of access, or they are denied opportunities to get assistance to help them to get out of these types of situations. So there's quite a few barriers out there that we already know that block women and Samoans from reaching these top jobs. With all research, I had to frame this research, and so I used the theoretical framework of intersectionality. It's probably one of my most favorite lens that I use, and intersectionality is really about how some groups have a lot of different layers. So for this group, I used gender, status, and race to show that there's a possibility that they are experiencing more barriers when you use these three layers and careers when they're intertwined. I also embedded the inequality regime. So this is the viewpoint from Joan Acker. So she studied white male workers in the United States, and this idea of inequality regimes is being used around the world. And so that proposes that inside organizations, and we see this here in New Zealand as well, that there are lots of things that are happening in the organization that support white men, that fast track their careers into top positions because they are considered the norm, that they should be in these top positions, whereas anyone else who diverges away from that type of stereotype are seen as abnormal or unusual. And we have research here in New Zealand that also supports that by Jared Ha. So he was a professor here in New Zealand. He did work on this and also found that, yes, in New Zealand, we have systems and processes that support white males. I'm just going to turn that up. White males into these top types of jobs. So intersectionality is a really good theory to use to see whether the identities of gender, race, and status actually do create barriers for Samoans. I now want to talk about afa-kasi. So some of us watching will already know what afa-kasi is. But for those who don't know, this term afa-kasi is literally translated as half-caste. And the roots of this term comes from British colonialism, and it originated in the late half of the 19th century. And it was meant to describe a group of poor people. They were supposed to be like the scum of British culture. They were the poorest, most disadvantaged and voiceless people. They were seen as bad people. And there's research by Damon, our wonderful Vice Chancellor, who actually looked at the afa-kasi from the Samoan point of view. So not only were they seen in the British context as being a threat to the English and the European races, but they were also seen in the Samoan culture as being a threat to the purity of the Samoan race. And quite often we know of stories, I know in my family, that afa-kasi people were beaten and they were ostracized and they were ridiculed. And some of them escaped Samoa to come to New Zealand because of the connotations attached to being afa-kasi. The thing is, with afa-kasi being a derogatory term, it's actually accepted. This term is accepted in many Samoan spaces. So when we say that it's normalized in contemporary Samoan culture, because it is, you see songs, Samoan songs that use the word afa-kasi, it's used everywhere. So even though it is a derogatory term, that term is accepted here in New Zealand and everywhere else. It's been normalized. So with that in the background, the two research questions that I was interested in is, what are the career progression experiences of female Samoan CEOs and senior managers? And how does gender, afa-kasi, and cultural status impact on their careers? So the methodology that I used, well, I used a Samoan methodology called Te Uva that was created by Professor Anai, and that's all about building relationships and making sure that we hear the voices of the Samoan participants first and foremost in the research. I interviewed 31 Samoan CEOs and senior managers. It's a qualitative, interpretive type research, so we used interviews. The way I analysed it, I used in vivo, so that's using a computer software, and I also did it by hand because you cannot capture the cultural stuff by using a computer. You actually have to go in and do it by hand. And these are the results. The highlight of this research is that gender, when combined with race and status, created career barriers for these Samoan women. And it was so significant that I knew I had to put it into a seminar. I had to write an article about it, because that wasn't the main focus of the research, but it just so happened that this is what was really prominent. So I'm going to share with you some of their quotes and some of their stories to demonstrate how these categories of gender, race, and status led to career inequalities for them. So the first theme is gender and race. So these quotes here, the first one, not only do we face gender bias in the white world, but it's also very male dominated in the Pacific, where Pacific men get the best top jobs. Who's hiring them? White and Pacific men supporting Pacific men. It's just so hard. So these quotes came from the Samoan women, and what they mentioned is that they noticed that, yes, there's gender bias in the New Zealand workplace, just like other women experience gender bias, but they noticed that Pacific men tend to get the upper hand in jobs. So they saw this in the public sector, they saw this in the private sector, that Pacific men were actually getting fast-tracked, whereas Pacific women were still lagging behind. Even though we now see that in government that there are a significant amount of Pacific women in these top leadership jobs, that doesn't carry across in the private sector. And so that was one of the first main points, is that gender issues became more pronounced when combined with race. And here are some of the labels that they brought up. So the first one is Pacific Princess. Now, this is what some of the Palangi or New Zealand white males called our Samoan women who were CEOs and senior managers. They called them Pacific Princess. Yeah, so when I first heard that, I laughed, but then I didn't think it was funny after I realized that it actually is quite derogatory, because not only does it refer to her by her gender, but also her race, Pacific Princess. And she told me that when she first heard that, she too laughed, but it wasn't funny when she realized that everybody else started calling her Pacific Princess, when no one else at her job was referred to by her race or her gender, just her. So I soon found out that from the other Samoan women that other labels popped up, like Samoan Superwoman, brown sugar, Pacific warrior, or terms. She's different to other Samoans. She's one of the nicer ones. So these types of labels, these are some of the examples, and I just picked the top 5, the top 6, that white New Zealand Caucasian men used to address Samoan women. And they said it all as jokes. But, you know, when you think about it, what are they actually saying? You know, these are some of the things that Samoan women had to experience as a CEO and a senior management. So a lot of them felt humiliated and frustrated that these terms were actually used in the workplace. The second theme that came up is gender and afa-kasi. And so some of the quotes are, when I see myself, when I am in some Pacific setting, they just don't see me as Pacific enough because I am afa-kasi. And another one said, I think it's about feeling insecure and threatened, where their pureness and whether this person is going to challenge them and they are not pure blood as them. Here are some labels that come along with those quotes. And I know that there are some people watching that who can relate to some of these labels. So if you are in a position at your job and other Samoans are there, they could call you whia palangi, which means you think that you're a Pākehā or you're wanting to be like a New Zealand European. The technical definition for that is aspiring to whiteness. So you could be whia palangi, or you could be afa-sainga, which is Chinese Samoan. I've had that called to me so many times, I just accept it. You could also be branded fake Samoans. And if you have a look in the picture, I was surprised to find that they have a Barbie, Polynesian Barbie. And that came up in the findings where Samoan men might refer to a Samoan manager as you are a black plastic Barbie. You're either too white or you're too black. Or Kinder Surprise. I think Kinder Surprise was the one that shocked me the most, because these women said that they've been referred to as a brown chocolate egg filled with white chocolate cream. So surprisingly, these labels were said by Samoan men to Samoan women who were CEOs and senior managers, and that is meant to represent Samoans who lack racial purity, or they are afa-kasi Samoans. So that gives you some context as to some of the things that they were experiencing in the New Zealand workplace. I mean, you've got to try and empathize and think, how would you feel if you were receiving these types of labels while you're trying to do your job, knowing that this is what some people were saying about you? The third theme is gender and cultural status. So when we talk about cultural status, I'll talk about that later, but it's really Samoan women who were either matai or they weren't matai, so they didn't have a title. And so here are some of the quotes about that. What he did was shut me down. He was relying on me to behave in a Samoan way, which would not involve challenging him. I think he expected me to not do things that way because of the cultural stuff. Had I been a 60-year-old man with a chief title running that organization, he wouldn't have treated me like that. He would have considered himself as my equal. So these were just some of the quotes that some of the Samoan women were saying, that because they didn't have a title, they were expected to behave a certain way when they were with other Samoan men who were titled individuals. This is how they responded. Samoan and Pacific men refused or were reluctant to associate or speak, collaborate or discuss matters with untitled Samoan women. Samoan men deliberately interfered, undermined, sabotaged strategic plans and projects that were led by Samoan women. So imagine that. Imagine that you have a senior role at your organization and there were some men who deliberately sabotaged your plans. They delayed projects because of who you are, and that you were afa-kasi, or because you were seen as a whia palangi, or because you didn't have a title. Now, to be fair, That wasn't the case for all Samoan women, because there were many examples of Samoan and Pacific men who didn't do that and who were supportive. So I do have to make that quite clear, that that's not the case for all of them. But because the results were significantly high, that there were a considerable amount of men that were mentioned in this study, this is why this paper was put together. So I wanted to mention that in Samoan culture, for those of you who are unfamiliar, that there is a hierarchy in Samoan culture. And so there is a social political stratification. So we have a system of chiefs. So you have people who are titled and people who are unentitled. And so the expectation is that those with the lowest positions, or those who are unentitled, are not expected to speak. They're not expected to take part in formal discussions. The expectation is that they are there to accommodate and serve those who are titled. So they help. One of their priorities is to help those who do have titles. So that ranking system, that hierarchy, that's solidified in.
Sorry, you have 8 minutes. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
That's solidified in Samoan culture. And it's also reinforced by Christianity, where you have God and men at the top, and then women, and then children. It's also solidified in the way that Samoans view women. So that's the quintessential role of woman that surrounds the home, the domestic life. So you've got the ainga, the hospitality that women show in their service, the church, and the community service. So those 3 types of strong cultural norms add to that influence of where Samoan men might say, well, you're a CEO, but you're still under this role serving men under this patriarchal system. So how did the Samoan participants feel about that? They felt demotivated. They felt hurt, angry. They deliberately acted dumb because they didn't want to upset the vibe at work. They avoided work events or social events because they did not want to be humiliated. The worst thing about that, and according to this paper, is that they delayed their careers. They didn't want to take up job opportunities where they knew other Pacific men would be around. And so that's really hazardous. That's quite dangerous. And that's very disappointing to hear that these Samoan women experienced these types of things at the workplace, because that was the biggest reason why they delayed or they forfeited some of the opportunities to increase their career opportunities. So their stories, they help us to understand that we can't just take things at face value. We've got to look at other things to help us understand that sometimes there's something happening in the background that we cannot see. And that's important for us because they are experiencing extra barriers that perhaps HR practitioners, they don't understand. And so this is why when I wrote this paper, there's a bit in there that looks at HR practitioners to be aware that sometimes for some cultures, like in the Samoan and Pacific cultures, there are these things that are happening behind the scene that could account for the reason why we don't see Samoan women or Pacific women putting themselves forward. There were some other things that came out in the research that we also have to be aware of New Zealand born versus Pacific born. Also need to recognize that there's Gen X, war veterans, so their experiences could be different. And from here onwards, I'm going to take this research and talk about it in other platforms. So I'm also looking at poverty, pay parity, care work, literacy, and numeracy. So that's really my research here. Thank you, everyone. This was I'm sorry we had technical problems and I had to come into AUT because when it rains at my house, I don't get the internet. So whaapetai lava, mahalo, te rima kasi, and thank you everyone for coming to my presentation. I'm passing back to Tara.
Thank you, whaapete lava, mahalo, and malusoifua. it's a very inspiring, and then I cannot stop shaking my head in awe when looking at the language. It's just so powerful, and I can resonate and I feel the hurts, you know. I really agree with you, the loss of talent. In a way, there are so many things that's so hidden culturally, and that this is really an eye-opening, I mean, for me personally, in a way that we seems like we live in New Zealand, you know, but actually within different segment of different groups, we still live in a caste system.
Yeah.
And I would also, if we have colleagues from other countries, to also hear that, you know, that caste system also still they carry on to wherever they go, like the Indian caste system. And yeah, so it's thank you so much, very insightful. And indeed, we are also fortunate here to listen and have this like very intimate discussion. Yeah, Betty, and I admire your work in this field, and then now we are also looking forward to hear your work on numeracy and literacy later, when, you know, in due time. So I would like to open with a question. I mean, to open the floor